Hi, I'm Shannon Hopkins from Rooted Good, and I'm here with my colleague, Mark Elsdon. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Shannon.
Our theme this season is church property, imagining good futures. We are hosting this season because we believe that right now the church in America is in the midst of a great transition. Churches' economic models are changing, and the way they think about and use their property and land is up for grabs. And as churches engage with their building and land use, it is providing rich, robust, compelling, transformative work in our communities across America. This season, we're going to introduce you to the pastors and leaders that are stepping out and showing us a new way. Their stories are phenomenal, and their work is helping to lay a path into a new and good future for the church and the world.
This week, we want to highlight the importance of acknowledging where the land that churches are on comes from and what was on that land before the church. All of the land in the United States, of course, was occupied by Indigenous people before churches were placed on that and built on it. And that's an aspect of church land that really is important for us to think about when we're talking about the use of church buildings and land. So today we have Reverend Chris Dela Cruz and Reverend Melissa Reed with us. They're from Portland, Oregon, and they were both involved in a really powerful project of a Presbyterian church giving land away to a coalition of Indigenous leaders to create something called Barbie's Village. And their story is full of some really deep theological reflection on land, on what it means to connect with our neighbors and our neighborhood, to understand how to partner in truly genuine ways with people across differences. And it just is quite an incredible conversation that we had with Chris and Melissa. What stuck with you, Shannon, from this conversation?
Oh my gosh. I loved how joyful they were. The joy and energy was so infectious. And I loved the way that they talked about the land. And for me, what I loved is how much this tied back to the episode with Dr. Jennings, when Dr. Jennings was talking about following Jesus all the way to the dirt. And finally, I really loved how much they talked about death and resurrection, that there's more life through this kind of work, more life than, like, they talked about it from their own leadership and for, the church, for the community, for the people that were impacted. But it really is resurrection life. What about you? Yeah, what about you? Or should we just dive in?
Let's dive in.
Let's go. Chris and Melissa, hello. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon.
And thank you for this important conversation. Yeah.
Well, we're looking forward to it. As you know, in this podcast, we are talking about this moment in the life of the church. We know that the way churches operate is totally changing. And specifically, the opportunity and challenges that the church is facing as it relates to building and land use. And we're so excited to be here with you today to talk about Barbie's Village. Chris, could you start by just telling me, just like in a nutshell, tell me about Barbie's Village.
Barbie's Village. So, yeah, thanks. Barbie's Village is started off as this wonderful vision rooted in the Indigenous community in Portland, Oregon, from folks here who had this vision of a tiny home village and early childhood center and preschool specifically for Native families. And first of all, you're thinking, wait, who's Barbie and why is there a village aspect here? So the organization Future Generations Collaborative, which is a collaborative of multiple Indigenous organizations, has done childhood work for many years in the community with Native families. And there was one volunteer community worker with that organization. Her name was Barbie. And the leaders always like to talk about, like Barbie's husband's name was Ken, so that there's an Indigenous Barbie and Ken. And that Barbie was, really passionate about that work, and her family were in and out of being unhoused. Family with children. Barbie died young of a brain aneurysm, and so Ken, in conversation with one of the leaders of Future Generations Collaborative, just talked about, like, how do we honor Barbie's life? And so, knowing what their own family went through, they had this vision, and started working with other folks, and even someone who did not knowing what the land would be, but, like, initial plans for what this could look like. But eventually it was like, Earl, how do we actually go about making Barbie's Village into a reality? And then, through various relationships that we could get into detail, because it's all about relationship, it came to what it ended up being was this idea of land back, that the Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian of the Cascades, the local regional body here, would give the land as an act of repair and restitution to Future Generations Collaborative, and so it's how it got from that seed of this story, and these human beings, to the church doing this, big act of, like, land giving to Indigenous communities. I know it's just been a beautiful thing to be a part of.
It's an incredible story and so important in the landscape. And in this whole conversation about church houses, where did our land come from, right? And we belong to. And so I wonder, though, what's your relationship to this project, Chris? Where are you in this work?
Yeah, so I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and for the years in which especially there is that discernment and work of the presbytery giving that land back, I was the pastor of a Westminster Presbyterian Church, which was the church that helped spearhead this coming to the larger regional presbytery body. And I could not do this alone. Like, one of the things I'll be saying throughout the podcast is that this work requires relationship and community. And so, that's why, I know you'll talk to Melissa, but that's why Melissa had to be here when you decided to invite me for this conversation.
Oh, well, that's a great segue, Melissa, Pastor Melissa.
Yeah.
How are you connected to this project? And you're not Presbyterian, so it's not just a Presbyterian work. So,
No, it's ecumenical and interfaith. Our Indigenous partners remind us they are people of faith also. And actually, they've held up a mirror to us to live into our values and theologies as they live out there so clearly. And so there were moments in this process where the church, I'll just say the institutional church, was scared, afraid in various ways, and living through fear. And they said, wait, you thought you people were people of faith. We're people of faith, and we trust Creator. Don't you trust your God? Don't you trust Creator? And it was, I feel like one thing that, if I don't get to it later, I'll just say now that this whole work and process and these relationships and this path of participating in healing and repair, of truth telling, of confession, of relationship, and new relating, repenting, and acts of repair with our Indigenous siblings has it saved my vocation as a pastor in these past years. It saved my sense of myself as a Christian. And I think it is restoring a sense of vocation to the church. And that's what it can do. But I'll just say that I was the lead organizer for a movement an ecumenical and interfaith movement called Reckoning with Racism here in the state of Oregon. And I was also an organizer with the 11 Community Land and Housing Coalition. And I was a local pastor. The way I got connected to Barbie's Village and Jillian Joseph, who's the director of Future Generations Collaborative, was I was a local pastor in Northeast Portland at the, I left that position 5 years ago, but, and we were discerning, we were hearing the stories of our community and our neighbors, and affordable housing was a huge issue. Just the vast gentrification that had happened in the city of Portland. I was a pastoring a church that had gone through this huge death and rebirth process, and we were really attentive to the history of that neighborhood and it being a historically Black neighborhood that from the 90s through the early aughts and into the and later the Black community was fractured and displaced out of that neighborhood in Northeast Portland, and that congregation, the predecessor body of that congregation, had lost all of its Black members out to what we call the Numbers or East Portland, and so there's just like a hyper awareness both of that people can't afford to live in our city anymore, and I'm like, who gets to be here? But also an awareness of the history and how we have had benefited from that history. That we actually, in our transformation process, decided to sell some land. We tried to build affordable housing on it. It was too hard in terms of the city. And so we, all the barriers to that. And so we were like, we need to sell this land to help us do this transformation process. And we better do something really good with this land because we have benefited from the gentrification of this neighborhood and the fracture of the Black community. And so one of the things we did was we started the Land and Housing Coalition, which is a coalition of faith communities that are actively working together to build affordable housing and address the affordable housing crisis in the state of Oregon through their land. Through that work, we met many leaders in the community, and one of them, through my Methodist colleague, Reverend Alan Buck, who's an Indigenous pastor and leader in Portland, connected me with Jillian Joseph, and she shared the vision of Barbie's Village, and it got kind of like tucked in my heart. If we could find land for this vision in our work, we need to do that. We need to figure that out. And so through our relationship with the Presbyterian of the Cascades, because in the land and housing organizing, we got connected to all the major denominations. We knew that this piece of land, the former church, Presbyterian Church of Laurelhurst in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, inner Northeast Portland, one of the wealthier neighborhoods on this side of the river, there was a piece of land in a building valued at millions of dollars. That was the Presbytery was trying to figure out what to do with it. And so we pitched, we connected with Westminster through our relationships because we knew they had a team in our Land and Housing Coalition.
Uh-huh.
We knew that Chris was newly on board as a pastor who had some organizing background from his time on the East Coast. And we knew that they had clout in the Presbytery because they are a large, influential congregation in the Presbytery. And so we connected with them there. They also simultaneously were involved in Reckoning with Racism. They had a team, and they had been doing their own land story work. They had been encountering their land not as property, but as land, as living and full of memory and story. And so they knew the story of the displacement of Indigenous communities through colonization, the plotting of that land that include racialized covenants and who got to live there and who didn't, why Westminster Presbyterian Church is so white, and the neighborhood that it exists within is so white, is all the legacy of these stories. And it's also why white folks have the land in the first place. And we know the history of the church, and the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny was like used to prove to ourselves that we should be here. And so as they learned these stories about their land, but also themselves, and compared to that, to the anti-racism work they were trying to do, it became, and integrating that into their sense of faith life, it became really clear that we need to find a way forward with repair. And so when we brought together Westminster, the core team from Land and Housing, their team from Reckoning with Racism, Chris, and approached the presbytery around the former Presbyterian church in Laurelhurst to say, hey, this is Laurelhurst's Westminster's story is not very different than the story of the Presbyterian church in Laurelhurst. It's just down the street. What if we, as the institutional church, a historically predominantly white denomination, what if we discerned through the land and in partnership with our Indigenous neighbors what repair would look like? And repair could look like land back, a movement led by our Indigenous siblings, and an opportunity for us to engage racial repair and live out our theology that life comes from death, and that that we can be wounded healers, and we can walk that path of Jesus in restoring wholeness to community.
You're describing something that sounds really quick. Like it just took a few weeks, a few months to to come to figure out, right? I mean, obviously not. No, it sounds like quite the journey and a deep journey, not just we can do something with that unused church. It's like much deeper than that.
Yeah, there was transformation that required time and trust, just even within, forget the other entities. Westminster going through that process with reckoning with racism and interrogating their relationship with their own land and the stories that they had originally told themselves about, like when you have church members who have, pride in a church that's been around for over 100 years and their families coming down that the transformational process that happens when you dig deep in that land story, it requires time and it is completely worth it. Similarly, there is a transformative process in regard to the neighbors around the land at Barbie's Village, because originally, with any new housing project, period, much less a housing project for unhoused folks and folks impacted by our systems, much less of let's just name it, like non-white folks, Indigenous folks coming in. It's like a trifecta of possibility for NIMBYism, and yet through the work that Westminster folks got involved in community organizing, got involved in being working alongside our Indigenous folks in almost like a welcome party for Barbie's Village through relationship. And relationships take time, and they're worth it. I still remember one of the first times we did a whole series of like relational work initially with the neighbors, house meetings, introducing ourselves, and I'll never forget. It was a Sunday morning. I'm I was about to preach that Sunday morning, and then I go look in my mailbox and I see a letter from like one block of neighbors saying like, how could you do this? Like, you didn't even consult us and like very angry. And I call Melissa. I'm like, oh God. And the letter was not sent to me, but to my supervisors, the head pastors of the church. And I'm like, Melissa, am I gonna lose my job? But Melissa, what did you tell me? Do you remember exactly?
I said, I think we should give thanks for this letter, because all the things in the letter were so fear-based, and we're not grounded in reality. And P.S., we did tell you as soon as we know this might even be a possibility, we started these house meetings and conversations. But, it's like fear of losing parking, fear of trash, fear of needles, and, like all of these assumptions, and things that, like, Chris is from New York. He's like, can't believe we live in a city where people like think they get to have parking outside of their house. Like, it's like, what a privilege, right? And I said, and there was veiled racism, in the letter. And I said, I think this is a gift, because I have never felt so clear that this is Jesus' path for us. Like I have never felt so clear that this is a faithful path forward. Because everything inside me, from our relationships with our Indigenous community and neighbors around this work, is one of love and connection and solidarity and grace, and honesty, truth telling, and this is fear. And so I just, I don't think I said this exactly, but it was like, yeah, like it all I could hear in myself was like, do not fear. Like this is, and it made it really super clear. Like, we're
and what I'll share, and then what I'll share is that, like a year later, because of the relationships we built with those neighbors, we went to a community, a neighborhood association meeting. We went to a bunch of them, but at one of them, I walk in and one of the folks who organized that letter, like gave me and our Indigenous, one of the Indigenous leaders, Jolene, like high fives, like because of the relational work we've done, and because of future generations having Indigenous Peoples Day, events. There was a shift, right? Like who gets to belong? Whose land is this? There was a shift with those neighbors because of that relational work. The other thing, Mark, you talked about, like the time it took. There's also just the trust that needed to be built between church folks and Indigenous folks who have every reason not to trust us. But we've been told repeatedly by Jolene Joseph with Future Generations Collaborative, like this is the first time she's ever felt that allies have had their back. And so transformation is possible when you do that, when you do the work.
How did you convince the presbytery that this is like the work of the church? I mean, I have to imagine that the idea of giving away, a really valuable piece of land was not the first place the presbytery was thinking of going. Just knowing, as a Presbyterian minister myself, knowing presbytery, I just can't imagine that was like, oh yeah, that's what we should do.
Right.
Like, how did you get to that point that they came to see this as the work of the church and as like somehow the fruitful, faithful next step?
Yeah. So, what we did know, what the folks in our organizing coalition and what the Westminster folks did know, was the power of relationship. I know we keep coming back to that. And so, rooted in values of, of church, of Jesus, but ultimately, it was through trust building, with key leaders who spearheaded this effort within the Presbyterian Church, like maintain that relationship with Indigenous folks, so that when you started, Jolene and the other mostly women leaders with Future Generations Collaborative, like were just so powerful that once you started building those relationships, like it was, harder to make this abstract, right? Like it was all rooted in real land and real story and real relationship. And then there was just efforts to talk about this story relationally. Like, we literally did individual phone calls and a Zoom small group meetings with people from different parts of the presbytery. I mean, listen, I know that with many presbytery votes, it's often like one committee says we're going to do it and another committee says we're going to do it. And then everyone in the presbytery floor is reading their material, like right before. I love Presbyterians. I'm not trying to badmouth y'all. But what I'm saying is, like, when the work is done to just on a human level, but with, intention. Yeah, like I said, phone calls and that work, like there's transformation that can occur. Like, Melissa, what would you add to that?
I'd say a couple things. One is Reckoning with Racism is a movement that has had 70 faith that has been like 70 faith institutions have been a part of it across the state. So I would say that, not in isolation, the conversation around land, and land not as object, but land as life and living and full of memory, as well as the conversation around the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery and colonization and whatnot in the Pacific Northwest. I think because like we are real close to the land, and also the history of colonization is a little shorter out here, that it you can go back generations to it, and there are people connected to, like, I've been in churches where the great-great-grandfather of somebody who's just died is, was the settler. So I think there's all of that coming together that in our context. And then I would say that so there was some good work that had been done in the presbytery historically. Like our colleague Eric Clark, Presbyterian minister who was on our Barbie's Village team, had been doing some of that work in the presbytery. But to get to Chris's point, I think I come to, like, the stories in Scripture where we think about where radical transformation happens, and it happens when there is a life-to-life encounter. When Jesus washes his disciples' feet, he's getting into the grit with them, life to life. And the hierarchies of the world are being diminished. I think about when Thomas wants to know, it's through the touching of Jesus' wounds that Thomas knows who Jesus is. It's through his humanity, right? And so I think about what we did is that we, through encountering the land as living, life to life, we evoked story. We also then encountered the communities that had been impacted as living and alive and still here in our midst. The Indigenous community has been shrunk, but it is still here in our midst. And honored their story and didn't come in as the protagonist. Like, we're going to heal this. We're going to fix this. It's like, no, we're wounded because we have done the wounding. So we are also wounded by colonization. We are not who we are. We are less human because of it. And we are a tool of it. And we are also, we are not living out our faith fully, because of it. We're fuzzy, we're distracted. And so I think that in encountering our siblings and ourselves as fully human, I'm Lutheran pastor, like this simultaneously saint and sinner of our histories and realities, Like then there's recognition, there's relationship, there's connection. And then encountering one another as faith communities. And so we did house meetings, not just in the neighborhood, but also we did house meetings throughout the presbytery on Zoom. We brought people together, and we shared the story of Barbie's Village. And we invited people's stories to connect with that story, both their story of land and their story of faith. And we built a movement. We grew a movement around Barbie's Village so that when it came to the vote at the presbytery, even though there were systems and structures within the presbytery that pretty much are built to make sure things like this don't happen, or get it or cause enough strife in the process. And we can talk a little bit about like our Indigenous siblings, like they had to go in almost completely white spaces and that were not always affirming of who they were. There were microaggressions, macroaggressions, and so we can talk about like their trust, their faith in us in this process to like withstand that, and like the learning that we all did in that process. But when the vote happened in the presbytery, even though the board of trustees was not on board, the majority of the board of trustees, I should say, because we did have allies in the trustees, it was able to get to the floor because the body wanted it to happen, the base of the presbytery, and it passed by 85%. And so we were told along the way by some folks in the presbytery, like, we don't want this to be divisive, like we're not ready for this. And the reality is, though, we did our work, and an 85% positive vote to return land, that's not a divisive vote. And so I feel like we gave people the opportunity to do discernment, and discernment requires life because that's what God deals with. And so by encountering land, one another, neighbor, our Indigenous siblings, our ancestors, past and future, because this is about legacy, right? As life, we had the opportunity to listen to the Spirit and be moved by that Spirit.
I hear a lot of both ands in this, a number of both ands. One of them that's interesting is so much emphasis here on relationship. That's, amazing. Like that's the whole only way this happened.
Yes.
And happens, right? And so much on the deep work that's needed in people's hearts, in their sort of their faith journey, their discipleship, you might say, if you use that language. Absolutely. And in relationship, right? But and you actually gave some land. Like, this not just a theological exploration, a Bible study, a small group discussion, a webinar, whatever. Like, you actually gave land that was worth an actual amount of money to, you know what I mean? Like, there's something that had to happen there.
And a big amount of money. A big amount of money. Yeah, and a big amount of land. And that's interesting because it's very easy, at least for many of us in mainline denominations, to talk about things forever. And then do we actually do anything though? Right? I mean, you had to actually do it in the end, right?
Yeah,
vote on it and do it and transfer a deed or whatever happened.
Well, and you say a long time, but Chris, you've only been in Portland for 5 years now.
That's right.
Is that right? So, it took time. It wasn't quick. And there have been loads of groundwork being laid for years. But in some of these projects that we're talking to, they take decades, decades upon decades. You did it. You did the work. And it's amazing.
I'll just say that I think it's funny because often when we're doing this work with folks, church folks in particular, our Indigenous siblings got what we were doing immediately, because they get relationship. They live their spirituality in their everyday lives. And so this is an opportunity for us as people of faith to do that too, actually. And so I would say it's enlivened the churches around it. Other faith communities got involved. People showed up, not just Presbyterian. It became ecumenical, and it enlivened the neighborhood. And I think it enlivened our sense of faith together. But the funny thing is, I think, is like when we're like, okay, we're going to engage this process of land or of discernment around our land, and repair and anti-racism, and now we're going to go out and be in relationship. And they're like, oh, it's too much talking. We got to get to action. Do you know what I mean? But the irony is that it is the relationships that lead to the action. They are actions. They're mini actions that over time build and swell into the capacity, the spiritual capacity to do really courageous, faithful things together. And so it's just a funny dynamic of this work, I think.
I'll tell you, I really love it. Melissa, a minute ago, you said it enlivened our faith, it enlivened the churches. And I feel that y'all, the two of you, Chris and Melissa, you are so alive on this call. You started, Melissa, in the beginning, you said, in this work, saved my vocation as a pastor. Chris, you worried, am I going to lose my job? But I a lot of people that listen to this podcast are pastors. And I don't know. I wonder, I mean, I know they're going to get the infectionist because, it's just so all over the two of you. But, when the narrative and the feeling in so many churches is that one of fear and scarcity holding on, what do you say to the church, to the pastors and leaders in churches that are sitting on assets right now? What do you say to them, particularly from your vocations as pastors?
Yeah, well, I'll start by just with my personal story. Every time I wear the collar, I am reflective of the fact that my own ancestors, and this is not far back in terms of my family, were themselves colonized by church people. The Catholics, the Spanish, and then the United States with Protestants. One of the main reasons that the United States came in and colonized was this idea that the Christian God called them to do so. And so for my own vocations, thinking, well, if I am going to wear the collar of the Christian church, which I believe in and I'm a leader in, then it's kind of like, what are we doing here if not the work of repair? If I understand what the scriptures say, if I understand the possibility even of what it means to be stewards of gifts instead of owners of property, what am I here for wearing the collar if not for that? And that's both a call of agitation, but also joy and peace. What you've heard from us has been expansion through giving, which I think is, I don't think, I'm actually going to not hedge here, is part of the central part of the Christian story.
Yeah.
Then that's call. Yeah. Melissa, what about you?
Yeah. And losing we gain, right? So it's the zero. Yeah. I would add just, it has, my theology is incredibly incarnational because of this work. It has flesh. It's earthy. There's life and blood and kinship. And so when we talk about death and resurrection, we mean death and resurrection. And so as as the institutional, denominational, and I don't think we're alone, but church in Oregon, in the United States, is facing its own death. The institution is facing its own death. The church, as my friend Juan Carlos and colleague will remind me, like, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus is alive and well. Like, but the institution is facing its death. How we've organized ourselves is passing away. It no longer serves us. Do we trust that from a life-to-life transition? My husband's a hospice chaplain. Do we trust that life can come from this? And I think the answer is yes. And we can become more of who we are in the process. And so, yeah, I think, and for me too, central to this work is like, it's an enlivening of the theology of the cross for me. Again, like my Lutheran roots, is like, God is going, like, we know Jesus most profoundly through the crucifixion, through the bearing of wounds. And so as I touch the wounds of my neighbors, and I touch the wounds of my own story, both how I have wounded, or my people have wounded, and how we've been wounded in that wounding. And the Holy Spirit threads us through those wounds. And so, like, that is where the Spirit dwells. That's where we know Jesus most profoundly. And life is going to come from profoundly those places. So I think that for me is like, this time is it's a hard time. It's laborious. It's full of grief. And it is full of life. It's full of opportunity to be more of who we are called to be as the church.
Yeah, amen. I'm there with you. You go, Chris, and then I'm going to move us to the rapid fire questions.
Yeah, sure. Because you said then specifically the listener maybe has assets, right? And like what you to say to them. I would say that the work of knowing the story of the land, and who is there, and who owns it, and who was there first, and wrestling with the idea that the church might have been a part of a stolen land process, but going through that work is a deeply spiritually transformative process. And then out of that land story, the process of letting go of scarcity and being transformed to see who your neighbors can be. Think of the Barbie's Village story of like suddenly all these neighbors around. That is a deeply spiritual transformative process. That sort of connecting with your own ancestors, right? And then connecting with folks way outside of who you think the church could be, because history has torn us apart, but there's opportunity for repair. That's a spiritually transformative process. And as Melissa mentioned, it enlivened other churches. If we're going to talk about the church transformation, like leaders and congregations are thriving more when you give first, right? So that's what I would say to that.
That's a great answers. Go, Mark.
What you're talking about reminds me of we had Dr. Willie James Jennings on at the beginning of this season, and he just asked the question, how do we return to the responsibility of following Jesus all the way to the dirt?
That's right.
Which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it, following Jesus all the way to the dirt. And what you're describing is that. I mean, I think for those of us of the Christian tradition, it is that, following Jesus all the way to the dirt.
I love it. I'm going to go back and watch that episode. I loved him.
He was great. Okay. Well, actually, I think we'll stick to the rapid fire questions, but you can take it in turn. So I'll ask a question, one of you answer it, then Mark will ask the question, and the other one answer it. How's that?
Sounds great.
Sounds great.
So before we wrap up, we're going to ask these rapid fire questions. First of all, what is one thing that you wish people in the pew of traditional churches knew right now?
We're talking about assets, and we named like the pastors like who have are in these communities with these assets. I want them to know that their greatest asset is their story, is who they are, their humanity, and the fullness of that humanity.
Yeah.
So, Chris, what is one thing you wish seminaries were training future pastors in this point? Community organizing, something else? What is it that you wish we were doing better?
I mean, my first answer would absolutely be community organizing in the power of relationship and intentionality around that, as well as the practice of connecting relationship with land to anti-racism work and to community organizing work. I think that aspect particularly.
I think I know the answer to this before I ask it, but if you were going to start all over at the beginning, Melissa, would you do it all again?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't. Again, I don't know. When the land back happened, we got when the meeting happened, it was a 6-hour meeting. That's a whole nother conversation on Zoom. The team came over to my house and we sat around, and so we had our Jolene and Alan and some of our other friends, Eric and Josh. And we sat, and I was listening to Jolene and Alan, who are both Indigenous, share what this meant for them. And I felt like I will never fully understand what this means for them. And I am still learning what it means for me. Mm-hmm. And it's just like unpacking it. And it's, it means life and life abundant and I'm still figuring out what that looks like.
Right.
Finally, we're asking all of our guests this season one question. As you consider the reality of the world and the witness of the church, what is your hope for the church today?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I don't know if Melissa gets to answer as well. But
you can answer as well.
Okay, good. Well, my first honest thought is my hope for the church is more like just my hope for the world is that everyone just feels their intrinsic sense of belonging in this world and time and place. We live in a time where there is lots of systemic work to have folks not know their own sense of belonging and dignity. And in fact, the tragedy is that the American Western Church has been very much a part of that horrific dividing of folks to not feel their sense of belonging. And so I hope for the world and for human beings and for even land and creatures to know their sense of belonging, and either for the church to get with the program, or if they don't, trusting that the Spirit will be part of that liberative work of that becoming a reality.
Yeah. I'll say my hope for the church is that we die well. And we die into life. And that we get to smell the sweet aroma of the empty tomb. Like it's sweet. Like dancing outside of the empty tomb, like and getting to bask in the life that comes when we give ourselves away, but in giving, we receive so much. It's mutuality. It's not a zero-sum game. That's my hope for the church, that we die well.
Oh my gosh. Thank you both so much. This has been, I feel like we could have talked to you all day. I could have anyway. Y'all are amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much.